Good morning. This is the final talk in this year's series by National Seminar Leaders. Vanessa Vitug, who's the seminar coordinator, will introduce Paul. Vanessa?
Good morning, everyone. First, I'd like to thank Dan and Jordan, Ian and David for 4 days of seminar talks. And many of us have certainly felt, man, I wish I could be in that seminar too. But today, we're going to add to that list as we hear from our final seminar leader, Paul Turner. Before coming to Yale in 2001, Paul received his degrees from the University of Rochester and Michigan State University, after which he trained at the National Institutes of Health, the University of Valencia in Spain, and the University of Maryland. Paul is a Rachel Carson Professor and Chair of the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology Department here at Yale. If you have heard Paul talk before, and were fortunate enough to be in his seminar, you know that Paul has many interests and passions, one of them being microbes. His work on microbes focuses on the evolutionary genetics of viruses and bacteriophages. His group specifically examines bacterial pathogens and RNA viruses. Like my fellow seminar participants this year, we of course have had so many questions about coronavirus, and Paul has graciously and patiently answered our questions during this difficult time in our history. Among his many accolades and associations, Paul was recently accepted in the National Academy of Science, and he is also a fellow in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His work with the Yale National Initiative spans 8 seminars and includes seminars on why microbes rule, evolutionary biology, and this year, Caretakers and Exploiters, Impacting Biodiversity in the Age of Humans. During his talk, we encourage you to engage through the chat box in order to post your questions or use the emoticons to show your reactions. So, without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Paul.
Wow, thanks very much, Vanessa, for that kind introduction. I appreciate that. And thanks everybody for being here today on the final talk of the program. So let's see, I will go ahead and see if I can manage to do this without messing it up. All right, people can see that? All right, I hope. Yeah, all right, couple nods. All right, wonderful. So yes, I have a topic that I chose for the seminar, and the fellows I think appreciate it. It's a very broad topic. And I should say at the outset, I'm not a conservation biologist or an ecosystem scientist. You're going to hear some of this today, but I am an interested scientist in terms of the future of the world, as well as the history of life on the planet, the biodiversity that came before us that we only observe in the fossil record, as well as the biodiversity that surrounds us. And we have a distinct problem right now. Humans are so good at impacting Earth and other creatures that live on it that a new age has been christened called the Anthropocene. You're going to hear about that today, or the age of humans. Our imprint on the world is unmistakable, as you can see on the right there, a big footprint. And we're kind of, it's very difficult being a human. I mean, we care about humans, we care about other humans, at least I hope we do. We tend to care about biodiversity, and yet it's hard to do 2 things at the same time. Continue to expand high quality of life for humans around the world. It ends up using a lot of the Earth's resources. A lot of land is used for agriculture. A lot of the world's oceans are used for providing food for hungry people by harvesting fish, and we're getting better and better about taking fish and other catch from the ocean. So it's very hard to be a caretaker of the Earth at the same time as being an exploiter of the Earth, and this is exactly what we are exploring in our seminar. Sure, there we go. All right, so here is an outline to take us through today. I have a lot of topics. I'll try and cover these in 45 minutes, leaving time for questions. First, I want to define biodiversity and why it matters. I'll talk about a distinct thing that we are doing to hasten the loss of creatures on the planet that surround us, and as we're increasing the extinction rate. This has led to, as I said earlier, calling the current geologic age the Anthropocene. And there are lots of reasons. I'll spend most of my talk talking about the reasons why our activities are driving species loss. There are 5 main ones, and I'll spend some time talking about those. I'll try and end on a hopeful, upbeat note about some solutions that might be possible to stop what we're doing, or at least to slow it down. This kind of a picture is familiar to the fellows in the seminar. We're trying to, at the same time, appreciate that the Earth is extremely biodiverse. We don't have anything to compare it to. We don't know of other planets that have life on them yet. We may discover this in the future. But currently, I think it's possible to say that a lot of humans appreciate and are curious about the biodiversity that surrounds us. And this picture is just showing you some examples of the immense variety of life, as well as the ecosystems in which these organisms thrive. So biodiversity, what is it? You could call it Earth's living variety in all its forms and interactions. But to do this, that's an easy definition, it's pretty brief, but it actually comprises many what are called biological levels. Just at the level of genes, we have some genetic relatedness to other species, such as chimpanzees, and yet we're very, very distantly related to other organisms. So if you add up all the genetic information on the planet, the biodiversity represents a whole lot of variation at the gene level. Species, this is more of what people think about when they consider biodiversity. It's the amazing variety of life forms that are visible to us throughout history and prehistory. This has been, I think, impressed upon humans, that we are surrounded by creatures that are non-human. So these organisms live in mixtures called communities, and those communities reside within ecosystems, such as forests, coral reefs, just to name a couple of these. But it's in these ecosystems where all that variety of life interplays with the physical environment. And some of that is shown in the colorful diagram here at the base of the slide. This is to emphasize that biodiversity represents not only the visible species that we catalog, but also how they live together in communities and ecosystems, as well as their variation that they present at the gene level. More philosophically, what does biodiversity represent? One could say it's the knowledge that has been learned, so to speak, by evolving species over billions of years in which life has occurred on this planet. And that is how to survive in the face of environmental challenges. So on the left here, you can see a cartoon representation of the early Earth before there was any life present on the Earth. And more to the modern day, this very colorful coral reef, it represents a wide variety of life forms that are surviving on the reef in these oceans and interacting with one another. So it took a long period of time for these modern day life forms to come about. And in this way, we need to appreciate that billions of years of evolution have happened on this planet, and along the way, lots of creatures have evolved. So if you see it this way, if humanity is impacting biodiversity and causing it to be lost, we're sort of burning the library of life. And when we lose these organisms, they're gone forever. So it's information that we cannot easily get back. So how does it actually impact your daily life? This is the thing that I believe most people don't appreciate. The air you breathe, the water you drink, and the food you eat all rely on biodiversity. A very easy one to point out is photosynthesis. Many of you have taught this in the classroom, or at least learned it in the classroom. And it's pretty obvious, I think, that K through 12 students would understand by the time that they're through with that education that photosynthesis is recognizable as something that is contributed by trees or other green plants that are in their environments. And this is the way that they capture light, turn it into energy, but they give off oxygen. So this is producing oxygen that is emitted into the air and used by other organisms. They also suck up carbon dioxide, which is a good thing. So you should appreciate that a long period of time ago, the life that first formed on the planet, not long after that, it gave rise to photosynthetic bacteria. And these are the ones that are still existing in the world's oceans. And we should be appreciative of them doing a lot of this early work and continued work in producing oxygen in the atmosphere, making it possible for large-sized organisms like us that require lots of oxygen to even be capable of evolving in the first place. Another quick example would be the very many pollinators that exist alongside us. Without these pollinators naturally interacting with domesticated plants and wild plants, there would be no fruit or nuts produced by these plants, and therefore a lot of resources would be missing from ecosystems. And I'll go on a little bit further to talk about perhaps some more obscure examples, coral reefs and mangrove swamps. You might know what these are, but you may not appreciate that they protect coastal regions from cyclones, tsunamis, and other weather events. Trees, including or especially in urban areas, absorb air pollution. So this is a good thing to be recognizing that green spaces in cities are very, very important as cities grow in size and number. Many reptiles, mammals, and other animals eat especially fruits from trees and other plants that produce fruits, and they disperse the seeds. So in this way, they maintain these forests that are very important for our survival. So the study of ecosystems reveal that countless of these interactions are happening on the planet, and this fosters the overall sustainability of our living planet. I'll go on further and end with some other naturally occurring items that benefit your everyday life, or at least frequently benefit your life, and that is, these are sources of medicines. So long ago, an example would be cinchona bark that has been used traditionally for treatment of malaria. But a very recent example would be the fungi that thrive within the fur of sloths. Sometimes these fungi have very useful purposes, such as killing cancer cells. And antibiotics, I think everybody knows what antibiotics are, but you may not understand that these have been present on the earth for probably billions of years, a long time ago, before we accidentally discovered them and now harness them to kill bacteria. So in other words, antibiotics are made by microbes to kind of wage war with one another, and we've now used these chemicals to our advantage. Wild varieties of domesticated crops and animals, they've already evolved to solve some of the challenges that we are facing, as I'll talk about later, with an increasingly warming Earth and other aspects of climate change. So we need to go back to some of the sources of the domesticated crops and animals to see how they evolved to deal with these problems, and we can get these insights into solving these future problems, or the ones that we already face. And so-called ecosystem services, everything that I've talked about to this point, this is really worth trillions of dollars. So it's very, very valuable to humans, and at least double the world's GDP. So as we erase biodiversity on the planet, we are also doing ourselves a disservice, because we are impacting ecosystem services that benefit us greatly. A last example from my own work, some of you know that I'm involved in a form of what's called bioprospecting. Bioprospecting is generally looking into natural systems, looking at the natural biodiversity of the planet, and seeing if you can take those organisms and directly use them for human good. So phages, which are these bacteria-specific viruses, right now we're grappling with a virus pandemic, but this is a reminder that some viruses have zero to do with harming humans, but they can be attacking other creatures, including bacteria. So I mentioned antibiotics a moment ago. The problem is antibiotics are widely failing. We've used them in earnest, solve a lot of problems, save a lot of lives, but now bacteria have evolved resistance to them. And instead, we're turning to the possibility of these naturally occurring phages that can be instead used to control bacterial infections. This kind of triptych across the middle of the slide is an example from our own work, where we looked in a lake in Connecticut called Dodge Pond. We found that a virus was thriving in this lake on some bacteria, and these viruses, these phages, have been used in emergency treatment of patients in the hospital to cure lung infections for bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics. And on the right, there's a young woman in a hospital room in Texas who is going to receive some of these phages through inhalation to try and cure a bacterial infection in her lungs. She happens to have cystic fibrosis, and these patients are very susceptible to infections by bacteria in their lungs. And the person on the right is a member of my lab group, Ben Chan, and on the left is the pediatric CF doctor for this young woman. So in the lower right, I only wanted to briefly mention that, remarkable to us, we've also been helping out in veterinary problems. So there was a loggerhead sea turtle, for example, in an aquarium in Miami, and the veterinarians there did not have any antibiotics that would treat the bacterial infection of this turtle, and we found some naturally occurring phages that were able to treat it successfully. All right, so that's a possibility of what biodiversity does for us, and now some sobering news about how quickly we are causing species to go extinct. Very charismatic creatures like T-Rex, shown in this cartoon. A lot of school children know what these are. They may not know what ammonites are. That's in the lower left. These marine organisms disappeared during a mass extinction, a separate event than the one that the mass extinction that led to dinosaur die-off. So that's long ago, that's prehistory. We see that through the fossil record, and humans had nothing to do with that. On the right is more reminiscent of things that we are guilty of. So the painting there, that is of the sky darkening due to passenger pigeons in North America that were amazingly plentiful, probably the most plentiful birds on the continent. And they were very good for hunting in terms of these huge flocks of them would literally darken the skies, and people decided to hunt them in earnest. And unfortunately, we hunted them out very quickly in an amazingly short period of time. You can see specimens of them in the Peabody Museum and elsewhere, but that's all we have left. The geologic timescale and the history of life go hand in hand on this planet. So on the right here, it's kind of a busy picture that's describing how the major periods in the geological timescale are defined by the presence or absence of life forms that are found in fossils. So the disappearance, of course, is extinction. And this is a way of defining through time geologic periods through what is and is not present. So let's take a closer look at this. Here's the entire history of the planet in terms of billions of years, and the present time is to the right. The most recent era shown here is the Phanerozoic. So if you expand that out, you start to see some of these familiar life forms. So first of all, you'll notice that it's a relatively small period of time, short period of time, relative to the entire history of the planet. But there are some familiar life forms such as Stegosaurus, which arose not that long ago in terms of the history of life on the planet, but it is no longer here. If we expand out even further, you start to see some of these mammals that are no longer surrounding us, some flightless birds. But way over here to the right, in the lower right, this is where you and I reside, in the Holocene. So this is a very, very small slice of time in the overall history of the planet. And sometimes teachers use this to their advantage. It's often hard to have students appreciate the immensity of time. Humans are not present on the Earth for a very long period of time relative to the entire history of the Earth. So if you separate the history of the Earth into a 24-hour period, you'll see here in a diagram, it's rather busy, but towards the top, what you'll notice is that the dinosaurs, relative to the entire span of time, they have not been gone that long ago. And humans only arose in the last 4 seconds of this entire clock. So this is rather sobering when you think about our impact on the rest of biodiversity, given that we haven't even been on the planet for a very long period of time. So what is extinction? Its impact is pretty immense. And a reminder is that species arise and they go extinct naturally. So the vast majority of all species that have ever existed on the planet, they're no longer around. Most of them go extinct within a 10 million year period. And this is what's called the background extinction rate. So this is kind of a funny graph. I'll just walk you through it. It's got frequency here on the y-axis and the percent extinction per 1 million year interval in only the Phanerozoic, a bit of that slice of period of time of the geologic eras. So the mean amount of time that, if you look at the species in the fossil record in the Phanerozoic, they're only around for about 10 million years on average. The point is that there is the appearance and the disappearance of life forms, but then there are different things that occur where they disappear rapidly. And these are biological catastrophes. The ones that we know of are called the Big Five. These are mass extinctions. On this graph, another difficult one, but I'll walk you through it, is the total extinction rate. So this stuff down here is what you'd call the background extinction rate. but it can jump up to a very high level during one of these catastrophes or a mass extinction. And the blue line is showing you the variety of life forms on the planet in terms of the number of recognized families or types of life forms. So the point of this is to emphasize that there are 5 big catastrophic events. The one that most people are familiar with is the one that wiped out pretty much the dinosaurs. And you may not know that the impact crater is not that far from here. It's in the Yucatan Peninsula. It's the Chicxulub crater. So this was recognized not that long ago and discovered as the true impact. But in the end, that's all stuff that humans had nothing to do with. This is the sobering reality of what we've done, especially as we've increased in population size recently. So if you look here at human population expansion, shown in millions, and extinctions, the extinction rate is hastening along or increasing at a faster rate alongside the how plentiful humans are on the planet and how much we are impacting the planet through our activities. So this has been called the Anthropocene. It's the current geological age, a period when human activity has been the dominant influence on climate and the environment. That comes straight from the OED. And this has now been recognized as impactful because it's the 6th mass extinction. All the other ones were biological catastrophes that were caused by physical events. This is a biological event, at least at its root. This is how humans are using the Earth and the Earth's surface for activities that we choose to do. And as a result, unfortunately, it's leading to a lot of biodiversity loss. We've been reading this book in our seminar called The 6th Extinction, An Unnatural History by Elizabeth Kolbert. She's an accomplished journalist and author. You might have read some of her her articles are published in the New York Times, the New Yorker, and she happened to be a Yale graduate. She majored in literature at Yale. So I find this a fascinating book. It's a Pulitzer Prize winner. I'm thinking that the fellows are enjoying it. It's a very sober read. It's both a fascinating lay public account of the problem. It's very approachable. I think it's a great book if you want to purchase it on your own. But the point is, it's very dismaying news about how pervasive this problem is due to human activities and the loss of biodiversity. Fortunately, today, Elizabeth Kolbert is going to join our seminar for a short period of time, even though she has a deadline looming for another book that she's writing. She graciously agreed to spend at least a half an hour with our group today, and we're looking forward to that. There are many ways to talk about how we are hastening extinction, and I'm just going to show a couple of examples. Here is a pretty typical one. If you just look as long ago as 1900, considering what would be the background extinction rate in purple for these major groups of animals, instead what is observed are the bars in blue, is that very many species in this one bar graph are disappearing to a greater rate than one would expect through the background extinction, and this is due to human activity. Less often do you see this depicted for plants, but this is sort of a world's view from a 2019 paper on the number and locations of seed-bearing plant species that have disappeared since 1900. Some locations are unfortunate hotspots for disappearance, like in Hawaii, there's 79 recorded extinctions. In the South African Cape region, Cape provinces have the second most with 37, but it's showing you that it is indeed a global problem. There is a body of experts that is important, that is responsible for tracking Earth's biodiversity and whether species are threatened, endangered, and unfortunately lost due to extinction. This is the IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature. Very recently, only a few days ago, they published their most recent what's called Red List report, which is the update on the endangered species. And this just gets worse and worse news every time they publish this report. And now it is estimated that more than 27,000 species are threatened with extinction, and that's nearly a third of all assessed species. So this is very important. There are a lot of species that we don't know about yet. A lot of species of insects and other organisms that are not so easily observed. We have to go into a region like dense jungle. We've been reading about this in Elizabeth Kolbert's book, and try and find these species and catalog them before they disappear. So my point is that this is necessarily an underestimate. these 27,000 species that are threatened with extinction, that's really kind of the tip of the iceberg of the known species that we've assessed to date. The ones that are unknown are disappearing just as fast or perhaps even faster. So this kind of a wordy slide is going to emphasize some more of the material that we've been looking at in the seminar. In this case, it's a UN report from last year, and it's a report of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or the IPBES. So there's some very dismaying news in this report, and I'll go through some of it with you quickly. Some majority of the land and marine environments are significantly altered by humans. Over a third of the land and 3/4 of the fresh water are now used to produce crops and livestock. Land degradation has reduced the productivity of roughly 1/4 of the global land surface, and now up to over $500 billion US dollars of the annual global crops are at risk of pollinator loss. Up to 300 million people are at increased risk of floods and hurricanes due to the loss of coastal habitats and protection. Roughly a third of the marine fish stocks are being harvested at unsustainable levels, meaning that if we don't stop doing that, those species will not thrive. Urban areas have now doubled since 1992. Plastic pollution has increased at least tenfold since 1980. Up to 400 million tons of heavy metals, solvents, toxic sludge, and other industrial wastes are dumped annually into the world's waters. And fertilizers, which many of us are familiar with using these in our own gardens, everybody knows what fertilizers are. Unfortunately, when they enter coastal ecosystems, this can impact bacterial growth in these waters and producing bacteria that will suck up the oxygen locally, creating what's called a dead zone. And these used to be very rarely found, and now this report is reminding that over 400 of these ocean dead zones are recognizable across the world. How is this happening? So I'll now spend some time talking about each of these drivers of biodiversity loss. And these are ranked in order of the most prevalent and problematic to the least, but let me tell you that they're all problems. So the changes in land and sea use that we are doing, the direct exploitation of organisms that we have done historically, climate change, which is an increasing concern, pollution is an increasing concern. There has been some improvement in air quality. It's a reminder, though, that pollution still exists. And as we go forward in time, we have to recognize that this is a problem for other organisms. And the last is invasive alien species, meaning organisms that move from one geographic region to another and displace the local species. This is something that humans have been involved in for a very long period of time, and I'll explain that. So first, changes in land and sea use. I'm going to go through some terrestrial examples, especially some very obvious things when you get to a helicopter or a plane and you take photos from on high of terrestrial habitat fragmentation. There on the left is something that is pretty familiar to us in the United States, but when you see this cloverleaf and this highway system, and you recognize that this very small patch of woodland here, there are creatures that thrive in this kind of habitat, and this is not a very big habitat for them to use. So the expectation is that if you reduce these habitats, that they are too small in size to support the biodiversity that would be expected to be there, it could be completely lost depending on the geographic region where this is occurring. To the right, this is more pristine forest. I believe it's in Brazil. It's definitely in the tropics, but you're seeing an intense amount of logging and removal of trees for commercial use, leaving only these remnant patches. And again, the same problem, but frankly, it's worse here than would be in North America. That's because in many areas of the tropics, the biodiversity that could be present in this very small amount of area is just truly immense and has not been cataloged accurately yet. So when we lose these species, they're gone for good, and it's unclear what they were in the first place because we never properly cataloged them. So looking more at deforestation, one example of it would be in Madagascar, this huge island off of Africa. This has been separated from the African continent for some period of time, and it has been separated for enough time that there are charismatic creatures that thrive only on this island and no place else in the world. And these would be exemplified by lemurs roughly a third of the lemur species are now at the brink of extinction because of land use practices in Madagascar. And just the other day, I told the fellows I was watching the movie Madagascar with my kids, trying to get a few moments of laughter in some bleak times. But it is quite sad to think about King Julian and Maurice here, these nice characters from Madagascar. These are lemurs. A lot of kids know what these characters are. They may not have ever seen a lemur alive, but not that long from now, lemurs may only exist in cartoons like Madagascar because there's no place left for them on Madagascar, the island, to thrive any longer. Another example from the recent report on the red list, this Madame Bertha's lemur is the world's smallest primate, fully grown. It's only 9 centimeters long. So it's an example of the amazing kind of flora and fauna that can evolve on the planet and sort of even defies our imagination. This is an incredibly small primate, and unfortunately, it's incredibly threatened. I was talking to the fellows about, in this case, I had no idea where the name came from. It came from a Malagasy primatologist and paleontologist. She's no longer alive, but it was named in her honor. And it would be quite sad when the species goes extinct. It is one way of recognizing her work. And believe me, there are plenty of amazing scientists, especially in the developing world, whose work goes unnoticed. And sometimes it is their name is given to some charismatic species from those areas, and unfortunately, those are the most threatened to be lost. Now, the reason we are doing this meeting completely virtually rather than in each other's presence is due to SARS coronavirus 2 and the current pandemic. As we change our land use, as we encroach on wild territories, as we rely more and more on domesticated animal species, this gives rise to an easier occurrence of what's called zoonotic disease transmission events. So we can encounter wildlife such as bats, either taking them directly from the wild, taking other organisms directly from the wild that happen to inherit a virus that was present in the bats, and then we end up selling it in a market. So there are lots of ways for zoonoses events to occur. And that's what the map here on the right is showing, that this is not confined to some region, even though those would claim it is. Instead, it is a worldwide problem, and it relates directly to our impact in terms of land use, and also that we live closely and ever more so with an abundant number of domesticated animals. So it's possible for these zoonotic diseases to readily occur. Other ways that we impact organisms is directly exploiting them. So there are lots of examples historically of overuse of species for human purposes. I talked about passenger pigeons, and they were essentially hunted to extinction. We have a lot of hungry mouths to feed around the world. Ocean catch is one way to do it, but that leads to overfishing. There are other organisms that we're no longer allowed to take from the ocean. The North Atlantic right whale is an example of, in this part of the United States, whaling was a huge part of the local economy. Right whales are called right whales because they are the right whales to hunt, and they were almost hunted out entirely from the North Atlantic. A remnant population of 250 adults is now left behind. They have very long lifespans, but this also means that it takes a long time for them to recover if hunting is no longer allowed. So that's good news that we're not harvesting them anymore, but the problem is we use certain fishing practices, such as this cartoon, where right whales are caught up in fishing lines and other ways of harvesting catch from the ocean, and they'll end up drowning as a result of this, because they still need to reach the surface to take a breath of air occasionally. Lots of examples in sub-Saharan Africa and other regions about humans hunting for sport. This is a very difficult topic that we've been dealing with in our seminar, because there are regions that are wonderful examples of how lots of land is set aside to conserve these species, and yet in order to push money into that very expensive effort, there are a certain number of what are called hunting medallions or licenses that these countries allow people to come in and hunt creatures that most people don't know that this is still allowed. So that's at least the stuff that is legal. Of course, poaching is rampant of organisms like elephants for their ivory tusks, rhinos for their horns, and this map on the right is showing the long ago historical range of the black rhino, and now the recent range is very, very limited compared to what historically had been there, and that's due to habitat loss as well as hunting. I found this picture on the left. I'm disturbed by it. A lot of people are disturbed by these pictures. This is a 12-year-old girl who bagged a giraffe, and she's posing with it. And if you want to get an education into this, you can find lots of these pictures on the internet, as well as a lot of growing concern over these practices, and a lot of people who express their horror and their dismay that this kind of stuff continues to go on. Here is an example that I assume you don't know. The fellows know it because I brought it up in our seminar the other day. This is another member of the endangered red list on the IUCN, showing an obscure, but I found interesting example of overuse of a species. You might be able to make out this is a caterpillar, one that lives underground before it emerges, and it's, I believe, eating plant roots. But there's a fungus that can infect this caterpillar, and it ends up growing out of the caterpillar's head, creating this thick stalk. You can see that better on the lower right. So what is this? It's the caterpillar fungus. It's the world's most expensive fungus. It's been valued in traditional Chinese medicine for over 2,000 years, used in lung and kidney diseases. It exists only on the Tibetan plateau. Here on the lower left is a serving of soup that costs $700 US for the treatment of lung and kidney disease if you use these caterpillar fungi. So this has been practiced for over 2,000 years, but only recently have they been over-harvested from this very small region in Tibet that now these fungi are threatened. So it's an example of how even microbes can be threatened with extinction through human practices. You hear a lot about climate change in the news. It's a long-term change in average weather patterns, primarily driven by global warming. So this is something that is due to human activity since the pre-industrial period, for sure, and it's primarily caused by fossil fuel burning that increases greenhouse gas levels. A lot of key indicators are obvious in the world and indicate the problem of global warming. So the land and ocean temperatures are increasing, sea levels are rising, ice is being lost from the poles, and the frequency and severity of these changes in certain weather events are quite obvious. It also leads to geographic range expansion of some creatures that you probably don't want in your backyard. And these are arthropod vectors that transmit infectious diseases. We more often think of them thriving in the tropics, but they're not. A lot of mosquitoes that used to be historically much further south around the equator have now expanded up into more northern zones. And with this, it creates the possibility that a lot more humans are going to be bitten by these arthropods and potentially get a virus like dengue virus or something else that's very debilitating and in some cases deadly. So this is a big change due to the overnight temperatures are rising, allowing mosquitoes to thrive during the cold of the evening and the nighttime without dying, and therefore they can live at more northern latitudes. This also already has been seen in seasonal traits in plants, their flowering time. In this map of the United States, you can see how the change in the first leaf date is changing, the change in the first bloom date is changing. Plenty of data show this for other parts of the world, but it's very impactful. I don't think people appreciate this enough. It causes a misalignment between the life cycle events of a species that could rely, for species that rely on one another, especially pollinators. It can also lead to a greater risk of frost damage. In other words, if plants are going through a certain developmental stage too early in time, then it could leave them more vulnerable to the effects of fruit, nut, and seed production due to frost damage. There's increased risk of drought due to earlier snow melt and longer duration of summer. There's a northern shift in the planting zone. So all of this contributes to a misalignment for species interactions with plants. It also contributes to greater pest damage because of their earlier ability to feed and breed in the growing season. Pollution, all sorts of forms of pollution are caused by human activities: air, water, soil, light pollution, noise pollution, radioactive, and environmental. And I'm just showing some pretty obvious examples here. Maybe you don't know on the lower right. This is the result of, I think it's a gold mine in South Africa. So a lot of our mining practices are very, very harmful to environments in terms of the production of chemicals that are leached off and just left to interact with the soil. They'll leach into the soil, they'll spread into the surrounding area, and it will create a dead zone of the inability for plants and animals and other creatures to grow in the presence of these mining events. More obvious are when waterways are heavily polluted and fish cannot thrive, when you find the unfortunate animals that have all sorts of plastics and other pollution in their guts, things that have been thrown away, not properly disposed of. The European hamster, this very cute animal here, is now critically endangered. And I was talking to the fellows the other day, it's a member of the Red List now, and it's not clear why the European hamster, which was thriving across Europe, is dwindling in number. So females are having litters that are much, much smaller than historically documented. Instead of producing 20 pups per litter, they only produce 2 or 3. And the expectation is this is due to some sort of toxic pollution, some toxins accumulating in the environment, but it's not clear what they are. So that's only some suspicion at this point without proof. And yet they're clearly declining and disappearing. And here's another example of something that is increasing in terms of pollution, but the impact of it is very poorly understood. E-waste or discarded electronics. These contain harmful elements such as arsenic, lead, mercury, and the extent of this is poorly tracked. It disproportionately affects human populations in less developed countries, so there is some economic value when all this discarded electronics are taken to some developing country and people go through it and they harvest precious metals and other things that are present in this discarded pile of electronics. They can actually sustain a living by this, but of course it places them in harm's way because they're interacting with some very harmful elements at the same time. And the threats to wildlife, I think, are very understudied to date. We don't know yet how impactful e-waste is to most organisms. And the last would be invasive species. So the ease of air travel, at least used to be easy. It's coming back post-pandemic. We'll see how much of it returns. My expectation is it will return in earnest. But air travel itself contributes to invasive species problems for obvious reasons. It's very easy within a day to make it around the world. And alongside this, species can hitch a ride. So they can now move incredible distances considering and relative to historically the inability of species to move long distances. Very many of them can't do that. On the right here are examples of how shipping contributes to this problem as well. This is where invasive aquatic species, especially through ballast water, this allows the ships to rise and fall in terms of the level of the water line. But as they're taking in water and expelling it in different parts of the world, there are very many marine organisms that are small enough to hitch a ride in ballast water, and they'll suddenly move to a portion of the globe that they hadn't resided in before, and they might outcompete local species in the process. So some species can invade and displace native ones, and that disrupts communities potentially. There's some examples here. I won't go through them in the interest of time. But once they become established, it's difficult or perhaps more damaging to remove them. This is the tricky thing now with invasion biology and the study of it. As we look more into the problem, we see historical events like the earthworm in this part of North America. That's an introduced species. And yes, it contributes a lot to what we consider to be healthy soils in this area. So technically, if an invader is around long enough and it's now doing something good, are you allowed to call it an invader anymore? It suddenly becomes a native, useful species. It's hard to know where to draw the line. Think of it now historically. So Pangaea, there on the left, when the continents were together in one supercontinent, through continental drift, we know that as they've moved apart, there were organisms that resided here in the portion of Pangaea that eventually became Africa and South America. So as these continents split apart, therefore it's not surprising that you could see some similar life forms that have common ancestry because they literally used to live next to one another, but over very, very long periods of time, due to continental drift, they were separated apart. So humans, in a way, through our practices, have been bringing species back to regions where they never resided before, or they used to reside in the deep past. And you may think of this as a recent problem due to Our travel networks, as I just mentioned, especially through flight, globalization and global trade contributes to this, but also historically just trade routes a long time ago. Even in this small region here depicted in the cartoon, there were plenty of creatures that made it around because they hitched a ride with humans, or they purposely were being traded back and forth between humans in this area, and that led to some spread. All right, so let's try in the last couple of minutes here to end on an upbeat note. This report also mentions some solutions. We could turn to sustainable agricultural practices. We could incentivize reductions in consumption and waste. We could effectively have fishing quotas and collaboratively manage water so that our future is more bright than bleak. Plenty of scientific research recommends solutions for consumers and businesses, just mentioning a couple here. Beef consumption is very harmful to the environment. Full disclosure, I do like beef, I consume beef, but this is a real thing. My family has been we are eating less beef. So the problem is, in terms of huge geographic areas and the production of beef for human consumption, this is very impactful on environments, and doing less of it would do us a lot of good in the future. Eating sustainably sourced fish rather than any old fish that you might find in a restaurant or purchase in a store is a better way to act as a consumer to help alleviate this problem, especially of overfishing and fishing of species that shouldn't be fished out from the oceans. And developing global financial systems that steer away from what's called the limited paradigm of economic growth. So if you just put your head down and look at economic growth as the end goal, then clearly we're just going to keep doing what we've been doing in the past. And the point of this report is to emphasize that we shouldn't be doing that. And if possible, we can get big business and financial systems to do something that's more sustainable. And the last that I'll touch on, we have talked about this in our seminar. I find this to be fascinating. I didn't know much about this, but environmental stewardship, especially looking at the lives of indigenous people and how they interact with their environments, how they could be living lifestyles that are less impactful. I'm not so naive to think that everybody's going to take on such lifestyles, but at least we can learn how their ways of life are not impacting species declines at the same rate. And respecting their knowledge is something that's critically important. So now they are given space at the table when devising effective solutions. I think this is a wonderful step forward because we need to hear from all parties on this, including indigenous peoples who are living alongside wildlife to a better extent and not impacting environments as much. So there is some hope, I think, for the future. Here's a quote. It really boils down to this, that all life is interrelated. We're all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied into a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one, destiny affects all indirectly. You might think that this comes from some champion of environmental stewardship. It came from a very enlightened person who recognized that social justice issues are paramount. We are returning, of course, to the amazing work of MLK in the current day. And he was a believer in environmental justice and understanding that humans need to be morally good to one another as well as to environments. So he spoke those words, unfortunately, very close to the time that he was assassinated, only a few months beforehand. So his words, I think, are very inspiring ones, how people who champion how we need to treat each other better and with more respect, this is something that also carries over into how we treat the environment and other inhabitants of our world. So we can learn through his teachings and others. In other words, we can learn from unlikely sources about how to solve the problem. All right, I will end the show there and I will stop sharing. And I'm happy to take any questions if we have time. Looks like we have about 10 minutes.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for your talk, and it's a good balance of bleakness with sprinkles of hope.
I tried. It wasn't easy, but I tried. Thank you.
But we have quite a few questions, and our first question is from Mike Duty, and he asks, what organisms going extinct would be cause for grave concern for life as we know it?
Well, I think very many of them in ways that we don't know. But the very obvious one that I think is rising to very critical importance is pollinators. So it's amazing how much we rely on natural pollination for the ability for plants to thrive. And these, as I said earlier, these interactions are being decoupled. They're being forced apart because some partners in those interactions are moving northward and the other is not. And there are other reasons. I mean, there are diseases that spread within insect populations, including honeybees, and some of these are obvious and impactful, and we know how we might solve them, and others are not. So I'm very worried about pollinator species decreasing.
Thanks.
Sure.
Our second question is from Zachary Myers. He mentions there has been evidence of a recent extinction event about 10,000 to 12,000 years ago with the cosmic collision in Greenland, which may explain the dramatic loss of megafauna in North America. What factors affect the resilience of life to rebound from these catastrophic events?
Yeah, that's good. So I think what I've been reading lately is a reminder of how impactful the Ice Age was, and that creatures that made it through the Ice Age had some ability to deal with declines, huge decreases in temperature that did happen over an appreciably long period of time. So the bad news is the world is not getting cooler. You might think that, oh, some of this biodiversity loss, if it were happening in a world that was growing cooler, maybe there's sort of a latent potential for some of these species to turn to old traits and old genes to kind of solve the problem. And that's not what's occurring. The world's getting warmer. So it could be an increased vulnerability to warming trends, global warming, that for all we know, as we continue to have species declines, they're going to decline even faster than we expected because of the inability for systems to naturally evolve to deal with very warm temperatures.
Okay. And Ray Salazar has actually two questions. His first question concerns the pesticides used. Are those the type of pesticides we currently buy from our local Home Depot or Lowe's? And the second question is about is concerning fish farms. So the question is, are the benefits to the environment worth buying that are in many ways mass-produced? Great
question. So pesticides have a lot of unfortunate collateral damage. So we do use them. They may be the only thing that we can effectively use to protect crops, but there's certainly enough evidence that the exposure of some creatures, some insects to pesticides, for example, is hastening their demise because they can't evolve resistance to them. I mean, the bummer is that actually we're using pesticides, and many of the things that we're trying to kill with pesticides are becoming resistant to higher and higher and higher levels of pesticides. It only causes us to undergo this sort of an arms race between pesticides thrown into environments and these creatures that we're trying to target. Meanwhile, on the side, there's a whole lot of flora and fauna that's adversely affected by pesticides. Fish farming sounds like a great idea. You would think it's a great way to reduce catch from the ocean, and that is the case. But it's an example of it's a complicated world and nothing comes for free. So there's a lot of downsides to fish farming. The habitat and landscapes that are converted into fish farms means that it's disappearing habitat that could be used for other purposes. It actually is a little bit in terms of human overpopulation growth, high population growth, leaves us vulnerable to viruses and other pathogens that can spread through epidemics. So in a way, as you create larger and larger farms of terrestrial animals, larger and larger fish farms, you're sort of creating the opportunity for some of these pathogens to take hold and spread in them, and then they'll spill over into natural environments. So sadly, I'd love to say that just go get all your fish from a fish farm, but that's not so great either.
Thank you. Ginger Lee has two questions. One is, again, about the honeybees and their disappearance. She asks, how far along is the severity of this issue? And are we any closer to figuring out any reason for, the reasons for their loss? And her second question is regarding climate zones. Her her area has changed from a zone 5 to a zone 6. And what does that shift mean?
Yeah, all right. So I actually don't know the extent of bee pollinator disappearance and how quickly they are expected to completely be lost. I think it's a long period of time. But we have been reading in the seminar about sort of like a lag or a debt that is created. So as you produce smaller and smaller populations, this is a very hard thing for people to figure out how fast is extinction actually occurring. Because we're on the planet in a small window of time, we're observing things, trying to make sense of them, but we don't have the crystal ball to see exactly when would that species completely be gone. We're making some estimate about that. And the point is, we could be living alongside creatures now that are fated to go extinct, and we don't even know it. It's very hard to understand all of how everything will come together to cause that to occur. And it's also difficult to know how, when we try and right the problem, how well will those activities, turn the tide back in our favor. I think this week we're going to learn more about bee pollinators and their decline, so you'll have to stay tuned for a better answer to that. Planting zones, I think the question was about climate zones and planting zones for plants, how those can change. What I've learned is that the breakpoints are very kind of small. I'm not sure about the best word to describe this. So I think it's pretty profound. If you have some plants that can extend into multiple zones, they'll be fine. But we read just the other day about some plants in the tropics, as it gets warmer, they're just not going to make it. As the weather changes, they're just not going to make it because they, as we said earlier, don't have the latent potential. They don't have the underlying genetics and variation to make it through it. So it will be interesting to see in perhaps less crucial areas like ours, how this is playing out. What I love is that a lot of botanists, a lot of conservation biologists, a lot of ecologists and evolutionary biologists are looking at this problem in plants because they can. It's very easy to do those experiments. It's not super expensive. You can create little habitats that are fragmented. So I think we're getting a hold of this through actually controlling environmental events in experiments. And time will tell, but it's a little unclear which plants are going to be moving successfully to other zones and others will not. I think that's what the question related to.
Thanks. Louis Bello asks, is there any relationship between the impact of the environment by humans and the most frequent pandemic or the most recent pandemic we are in the last few years?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Land use changes, encroaching on wild habitats, the way that we harvest food from the wild, the way that we sell wild animals in markets. And I'm not only pointing the fingers there because, as I said earlier, the more that we rely on larger and larger farms that distribute food out in a network, these are all vulnerabilities for pathogens that are zoonotic to emerge. They just are. And the problem is, we were very concerned with flu pandemics, and we didn't learn our lesson enough from the first SARS epidemic, and what's called MERS, which emerged from camels into humans in the Middle East. I mean, these are coronavirus events that we should have been a little bit more fearful of future coronavirus epidemics and pandemics. And now we know. But I don't want to end on too sour of a note. The problem is we just don't know. It's very hard to predict what the next emerging pathogen will be. For one thing, our ability to do surveillance in wild populations to see what's even there is very, very poor. It takes a ton of money, and it's very ineffective to even try to do it. So we're trying, my lab group and others, and increasingly more because of the pandemic, people are going to try to predict what future emergence looks like and to try and create ways to protect ourselves from those events. But tough question. Look to future research and believe in science because it is real. And hopefully we'll be in a better state the next time it happens.
Okay. And Ryan Bennett asked, what specific environmental justice solutions or responses broadly might you suggest to lessen human inequities?
Ooh. Definitely the not in my backyard thing worries me, because populations and communities that have wealth, economic means, they are more influential for political and other decisions, and they can prevent something from literally happening in their backyard. And this increasing difference between those who possess wealth and those who do not creates, I think, an increased vulnerability to human populations to suffer not only economically, but to suffer through health in terms of exposure to toxins, pollutants, etc. So I am keenly aware of this. I think a lot of people are. This is an issue of environmental justice. It's just one example. My hope is that one of the few bright spots post-pandemic would be the observance of people who are vulnerable to the worst of this. It just sheds greater light on, we need to take attention to this. We have to protect all humans from the possibilities of harmful environmental events. And it should have nothing to do with wealth. And this is a tough thing. I'm not naive. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's becoming increasingly apparent.
Okay. I recognize that it's after 9 a.m. or 12 your time.
It's 12 somewhere,
12
including
somewhere.
here. Thanks everybody for your attention. And just a wonderful program. We're making it together through this, but I'm just so happy to be interacting with you all through this program.
Thank you, everyone, and good luck on your submissions of your first draft.